Azir is broken, and I'm going to talk about why. Before I start, I want to just kind of qualify myself. I've been an Azir main essentially since his release on September 16th of 2014. So our little emperor is almost 3 years old now. I have 475,000 mastery points, and currently in Season 7 I'm sitting at Plat 2 with a 62% win rate on him and a 3.37 KDA. So I'm not a new Azir player by any means. I've played hundreds of games with him across normals, ranked flex. Whenever I get the chance to play him, I play him. But as a lot of players know, he's not in the best spot right now. He has a 0.9% play rate and a 44.23% win rate. And these numbers are according to the latest snapshot on champion.gg. The interesting thing is that he actually gets to above a 50% win rate with players that have 150 or more games played with him. So that's definitely indicative of him being difficult to pick up and use. So before I get into talking about his overall current state and the changes that Riot is looking to make to him, I just want to kind of go over his nerf history, kind of go over the things that led to where he is. So if anyone played Azir on release, you know that he was a little ridiculous. He was absolutely oppressive. His kit was way overloaded. His soldiers had so much range, and then they had additional spear range when they would auto attack that would go outside of their max, quote unquote max range. He was able to dash into people, knock them up, use the ulti. The ulti would last 7 seconds at rank 3. So it was just hugely oppressive. It was really hard to deal with Azir. And Riot pretty much realized this shortly after his release. Initially after his release, he was actually really bad because he had so many bugs. But Riot went ahead and fixed a lot of those bugs in the subsequent patches after his release. And then as the players learned him and as the bugs got fixed, it was kind of becoming apparent that he was a little overpowered. So Riot recognized that and justifiably nerfed him. So they started with a Q damage down, and just for your information, the Q is the ability that sends the soldiers out to wherever Azir is targeting. And then they nerfed the soldier auto attack range. They nerfed it by about 19%. So about a fifth of their attack range was taken away. And that was actually a pretty sizable nerf. But Riot figured that then they over nerfed him, so they upped his attack speed, his base attack speed a little bit, and they increased the soldier auto range but decreased the range that the spears had outside of that auto attack. So just to recall the mechanic, when you attack with Azir, you attack a lot of units in a line, and so from the unit that you're attacking, it would now go 50 units past that into other enemies. Before that, it was 100 units, so they nerfed that by half. So that was an overall nerf from the original numbers, but it was a buff from the 1/5 cut that they did. And then in a following patch, they removed the knockup on his E, and they removed his attack speed gain when he gains cooldown reduction. So if you recall on release, you would build like Morellos or Nashers or something like that, and every point of cooldown reduction you had gave you attack speed in return. So Riot removed that and put the attack speed gain on ranks of his W, which is his Arise or his soldier summoning. And so what this does is this took away his early game power spike when he would get that first item, because he would get all the AP and cooldown reduction from that first item, and then he would get attack speed on top of that. So that was the rationale for that change. And then Riot once again nerfs him. They apply a range to his dash, so it's no longer global. They reduce the collision radius when he's flying towards an enemy. His Q no longer damaged enemies for every soldier that it hits. So it used to be that if you use the Q, every soldier that passed through an enemy would do damage. Now, any soldier that passes through an enemy beyond the first does no damage. So that was a huge nerf to his damage output. And it was actually a nerf to his playstyle because you no longer needed to position your soldiers in a way that they would all go through the enemy that you're attacking. They nerfed his ultimate, his Emperor's Divide, his wall. They nerfed that duration to 3 seconds when it used to be, I believe, 5, 6, and 7 seconds at ranks 1, 2, and 3 respectively. And then they also removed the direct damage that his W could do to turrets. So if you recall, he used to be able to walk up to a turret, press W, and do a couple hundred magic damage to it. They removed that. And at this point, they probably realized, oh, we nerfed him a lot. So they gave him some minor buffs. They reduced the recharge time on his soldier's W. So he has it's like a Teemo shroom where he has a certain number of soldiers that he can cast. Well, the recharge time was reduced by a few seconds at every rank. They increased his turret damage gain per minute, so his passive, his Sun Disc, and they gave him better mid-game scaling on his soldier auto attack damage. So that kind of evened out the spike that he lost from the attack speed stuff that was earlier in previous versions of the game. And they also gave him magic resist growth. So he used to have 0 magic resist per level, now he's got 0.5, I believe it is. But as you can see from what I've laid out, the pattern has been consistent nerfs since actually patch 5.3. We are now on patch 7.12, with patch 7.13 coming around the corner. So for a number of seasons, he's actually been nerfed consistently far more than he's been buffed. Nearly all of the power gains that he's had have been from bug fixes to make him work properly. He hasn't had any number tweaks beyond nerfs. All of the power that I've noticed after a couple years of playing him has come from just more consistent damage because of bug fixes and not because of number increases. And then, of course, you have other stealth nerfs, which are unintended consequences of changes to other things. So, for example, Rylai's Crystal Scepter got its AP nerfed massively and its health nerfed massively, which both of those things benefit Azir and were nerfed. And then, most recently, the Doran's Ring unique passive change. So, Doran's Ring used to be the passive where you would get mana back on killing an enemy. It's now a unique passive, so you can't buy 2 Doran's Rings to keep up the mana regen. But now that I've gone over all of the nerfs, I kind of want to address the problems that he does have, regardless of the nerfs, regardless of any sort of buffs or whatever. He has been consistently a problem, especially in the right hands. So he has safe, consistent poke, which makes him really oppressive against especially traditional mages in the mid lane. If you're going up against a traditional caster and you're a skilled Azir player, you're going to win that matchup probably 90% of the time, simply because they cannot answer your damage without outside help, like without ganks, without getting fed off of other lanes, etc. He has massive zoning potential, so you can take him and effectively zone entire teams out of important objectives. You can zone them out of turrets, you can wave clear real quick, you can zone them out of dragons. If you pinch them in a tough spot, you can do damage to multiple enemies at once, which causes them to want to avoid wherever your soldiers are, which in itself is massively useful. He has relatively high damage output actually in team fights in late game. His early and mid game are really weak, but when he gets to that late game stage and he fills out a couple of his items, and especially if you have a good team comp where you're bunching enemies together, he does a lot of damage and he really can control games at that point. He's got self-peel, both in the form of his wall, and he's also got that escape, his E, his shifting sands that he can use to dash to a soldier. So he's got that mobility, that escape, that self-peel. He's also got really strong engage using all of those abilities as well. So he can dash into a middle of a team when he sees an opportunity, and he can create plays for his team by pushing the important people out of position. He can catch people out really easily. He can dash straight into the back line, push the back line into your tanks, into your damage dealers, which is very useful, obviously. His passive is extremely powerful. It allows you to hold down a lane whether you're pushing or getting pushed. It really stops the progress, resets the momentum, and usually turns it in your favor. If your team is smart enough to fight under an Azir turret, you're going to win a team fight every time. Every time you're going to win a team fight. So it's a very good passive. But the most important thing that is a huge problem for at least balancing Azir is he's got an extremely high skill cap. He's probably got the highest skill cap in the whole game. Good players are able to fully utilize him and control the game extremely effectively. So a good player can really actually control the game. Like when people, especially when people don't know how to play against Azir, or when they don't have much experience playing against Azir, if there's a good player, a good Azir player in the game on your team, you're gonna win more often than not. He's just really good at controlling games in that way. But he does have some other problems. For example, for new players, new people to Azir, he's going to be really hard to pick up, and it's going to be even harder to do consistently well. My experience of my first 100 or 150 games was that I was not getting consistent performance. I would have good games, I would have bad games. Mostly it was bad games. He didn't feel right. It was really hard to get the feel down. He has mana issues, so you can't be using abilities as often as you would want to because of the fact that he uses so much mana, especially in the early and mid game. And then, of course, he's got that issue of low early and mid game damage. And that stems partially from the build that you're kind of shoehorned into. Nashor's Tooth really isn't an item that you want to build up if you want to do a lot of damage, but it is an item that is critical to build first on Azir if you want to be successful. I shouldn't say critical, you can do well with other builds, but for players that don't play him often enough, Nashor's is going to be the easiest path, but it also doesn't exactly help in the damage department either. So Azir's kind of in a weird spot where he's a champ that is simultaneously awful but also really good, and that comes from the huge gap in his skill floor and his skill ceiling, which I think the gap is the largest in the game. The difference between the most basic first-time player, bronze player, utilizing him, and a pro player playing him, the difference is so stark. It's the greatest difference that you can see in any champion, in my opinion, and that makes him really hard to balance. So this is Riot's rationale for nerfing him so much, is because he was a very big problem at high levels of play. The pros were playing him ridiculously, like they were dominating with him, and they couldn't allow that to continue. So they had to nerf it, but that also resulted in the general league population not being able to pick him up easily. And so that's why you see the resulting play rates and the win rates. It's just because people aren't playing him because he's so hard to play. He's so hard to do well with, and it's not a good feeling when you go to play a league game and you have to play 100+ games to even be decent at the champion. So that's a huge barrier to entry, caused partially by the nerfs, but also caused by Azir's play, his kit, and just his general play style. So in balancing Azir, Riot made the smart choice, and they balanced him for high level play over general play. You don't want players at your highest level to be just dominating and destroying games all the time, because that doesn't make for interesting competition. So they had to nerf him, they had to balance him around the high level play, which hurt general play. But then that also introduced another problem. Because of his low play rate, because of his difficulty, it's hard for Riot to make money. They don't want to make skins for him because no one plays him. So they have a champ that's sitting there that's not doing anything, that's not making them money. And from a business perspective, that's not good. So you can kind of see why Azir is actually in a spot where he does need a little bit of work. And it needs to be significant work beyond just tweaking numbers. So 4 days ago, which was the 19th of June, 2017, Riot made a forum post, actually Wavebreak made a forum post about general Azir discussion and the directions that they want to take Azir in. So I'm going to go over that forum post and then give my thoughts about it. So Riot's goals in reworking or doing a gameplay update for Azir is that they want to increase opponent play options when playing against Azir, and they want to increase Azir's live ranked performance. And this goes back to what I was talking about with the general play. It seems like one of their goals is to make him more accessible in general play, which is a good thing. And they also want to preserve his core play pattern of summoning sand soldiers and using them as auto attacks. That goal is pretty much a no-brainer to me. Any significant change to that mechanic would be a new champion. It's something that's unique to Azir, and it really can't be changed all that much without making him feel like a completely different champion. So then they outline in the forum post 2 major directions that they're looking at taking Azir. The first one I'm going to call the skirmisher version of Azir. And their goals with this one is to reduce Azir's soldier command range, which exposes him to more opponent damage and CC opportunities when he is dealing damage. The ranges would still be decently long. They are saying shorter by about roughly 15%. And this affords that his mobility profile would remain similar to live. So that means that he's going to keep his dash, he's going to keep his engage potential, his escape potential, all of that stuff. But they also note that it might mean he needs more on-demand survivability. And they note that it's the direction that reduces the most pressure on them to dramatically change functionality on his current spells. So basically, they're looking to just rein in some of his power. They're looking to overall buff him, but rein in some of his range in order to keep his mobility. So that's a change that's going to, number one, be the least work for Riot, and number two, it's going to keep him as similar to what he's like now. So the second option that they're considering is what I'm going to call backline Azir. And their goal with this is to keep Azir's live soldier command range, but reduce his mobility profile so he's more easily killed when you do have the tools to close the gap on him. So this goes the other way. This gives him the extreme range that he does currently have, but removes his mobility, so it makes him a little less safe in the backline. This change would allow soldiers to last longer than they currently do, and it means that they're going to remove his ability to drift or dash to his soldiers. I'm going to go into detail how I feel about this later, but the other thing that they're going to do, or that this change will help with, is that it's going to restrict Azir to be even more of a backliner. So that's going to kind of solidify his identity as a backline, long-range kind of emperor that uses soldiers to accomplish his goals rather than doing it himself directly. So they go on to say, regardless of our choice in direction, we will most likely be buffing Azir's sand soldier stab damage and overall DPS potential. That's good. I'd especially like to see it changed for early and mid game, because like I said, Azir currently has a lot of late game damage when he fills out a few items. It's just his early and mid game that are really hard to do damage with. They go on to say, at the same time, we will also be looking for ways to ensure his laning phase is less oppressive when his numbers are tuned up. So that's pretty self-explanatory. He is a very oppressive champion, even with his low damage numbers currently. It's still hard to kind of want to walk through soldiers that are in your way because even if you're taking a little bit of damage, it's still damage. You don't want to take free harass. So that is a good thing that they need to be looking out for. Then they say, a decently successful mechanic we have tested a bit so far is reducing his soldiers' AoE damage early game and scaling it back up to 100% by champion level. This means that Azir can still have threatening single target damage throughout the match, but less wave control early game. So, a couple of my thoughts on these directions. So, just to say that I'm opposed to any change that alters his core identity, which is an emperor that sits in the backlines while commanding his small army. So, I feel like update 1 is going to be more harmful to Azir's core identity than option 2. So the skirmisher option is going to reduce a lot of his range, which is going to probably hurt his identity. You're probably going to be dashing around a lot more, utilizing the mobility more, instead of sitting in the back line and just auto-attacking. But I realize that for the sake of his health as a champion, he does need some of these updates. So let's talk about the skirmisher option a little more. So this option retains his mobility, which is good because the Shurima Steamroll and the bananas are a huge part of what makes him fun. Being able to dash into an enemy, push them in your team, dash into their backline, you know, or even to escape or cross several walls through the jungle to evade some danger. That's a huge part of what makes him fun. And then being able to switch directions on a dime while you're flying into someone, you can pull off some crazy angles. It's just a whole lot of fun, and it opens up a lot of possibilities for how you play Azir. But Riot raises the concern that they're going to need to require more on-demand survivability if they make this change, because he is going to be closer to where all the damage dealers are. So my suggestion for this is, before his ulti got nerfed, it was actually a really good tool for survivability. So what they could do is they could reduce the cooldown on his ultimate and give it back its duration, or just reduce the cooldown on the ulti enough to where he can use it when he needs it. And then they could also give the movement speed buff back to the ulti, at least for Azir himself. So having the ult up more often and then getting a move speed buff from using it would be a huge step in the right direction for that on-demand survivability that they're looking for. So a couple of ult changes would really fill that void that Riot's concerned about. And I want to bring up a good strategy that existed when the wall lasted for 7 seconds. Is I used to, even if I was in the middle of the open and I was getting surrounded by 2 or more enemies, I would throw up the wall in the middle of a lane or something, not hit anything, but then I would straddle the wall to mess with the enemy pathing and to kind of avoid dashes from multiple sources. So that was a huge indirect source of power that really increased my survivability. It didn't work all the time, but when I did it right, it more often than not allowed me to escape with my life. So they should consider at least either reducing the cooldown on the ulti or increasing the duration on the ulti, or a combination of both, because that really is going to put a lot of survivability back into Azir. So my final comment on the skirmisher kind of path is that it's the least impactful choice because it doesn't alter Azir's gameplay drastically. And if you're like me, if you don't like change a whole lot, especially when you've dedicated so much time to a champion, this one kind of looks like the most appealing option. But let's talk about option 2, which is the backline Azir. So Riot's goal with this is to reduce his mobility, or just completely take it away. If I'm reading that correctly, they want to remove the shifting sands, but they want to keep his range. So that's going to really solidify his identity as a backline emperor, the guy that sits back and orders his soldiers to do everything, all the damage. The problem with this change is that it's very restrictive and it guts a huge part of the playstyle. So that Shurima Steamroll, that banana, that's probably 50% of what makes Azir fun to play, is having those options available. So I'm concerned that the removal of that complexity is going to make him less fun to play. That will reduce the gap between the skill floor and the skill ceiling and bring him more in line with other champions, but it's also removing a huge part of what makes him fun. So with the removal of this complexity, however, you can put more focus on the manipulation of soldiers rather than the manipulation of Azir himself. So you don't have to worry as much about your positioning, or you don't have to worry as much about watching for openings in the enemy backline so you can dash into them and steamroll them. But again, the problem exists that you're gutting complexity without putting any back in. So if they're going to change the E, I would like to see a new E that facilitates the long-range backline playstyle, but also puts complexity back into his kit. So replace that complexity that came from the dash and the bananas and stuff like that. Put in a new ability that works better with the long-range playstyle, but also has equivalent complexity, or near equivalent. If it's slightly less complex, then that's fine, because you still need to close that skill floor and skill ceiling gap. But nevertheless, we need that complexity in there. That's a huge part of what makes him fun for players. So I've kind of addressed the skirmisher and the backline gameplay, and when I first read the forum post, I kind of was leaning towards the skirmisher gameplay because, like I said, I hate change, and it's the thing that would prevent Riot from changing him too much. But as I was writing this up, as I was making this video, I kind of realized that if they did a good job solidifying that backline Azir, I could do without the shifting sands, the steamroll, the banana kind of gameplay, if the new E was compelling enough and the soldiers did enough damage from the backline and Azir was relatively safe in the backline. I don't know exactly how Riot is going to achieve that, but if they pull it off, it has a potential to really help Azir out, help the player base out in picking up Azir without sacrificing too much of what makes him fun. So some other thoughts about this change: they didn't make any mention of his Sun Disc passive, which is really good. This passive shouldn't be changed beyond the number tweaks that are necessary for its damage to bring it in line, whatever. In my opinion, the passive cooldown is perfect. It's 3 minutes long. It's impactful but not oppressive, and it works really well when it's used well, but it's useless when it's used inappropriately. So in my mind, it's a perfect passive. There's a lot of player choice there in how you want to use it, and I think it's probably the best designed passive in the game. Another note on the Sun Disc passive is that it fits the backline Azir more than the skirmisher Azir. If the skirmisher Azir is going to be repositioning constantly and have shorter range, it doesn't really fit with his current passive. But backline Azir can sit at his turret and send out soldiers to poke and harass and wave clear while he's sitting underneath the safety of his turret. So that's just another thing that kind of makes me lean towards the backline Azir more, is because of that passive interaction. I'm very hopeful that Riot has at least recognized his weak damage output early game. So they've recognized this, and it makes me hopeful that they understand the problems with him, and they're actually going to set out and fix him, which is a huge relief to Azir players, I think, after basically 2 consecutive years of nerfs. And going back to the skill gap, they can close the skill gap by reducing the complexity and upping his damage. So that's going to bring him more in line with similar high skill cap champions. He's still going to be relatively high skill cap, I think, but removing that Shurima Steamroll Banana complexity is really going to kind of bring the pro players more in line with the general population. There's still going to be a gap, and you still want a gap because that's what makes high level play fun to watch, but it's not going to be so extreme anymore. And so that would be a bad change for players like myself that enjoy high skill caps if they shrink that gap too much. But it's good for the game overall, it's good for the champion, and it's good for Riot, because if they get more people playing Azir, then they have another champion that they can make skins for and make money off of. So all around, I think it's in everyone's interest to close that skill gap, bring him more in line, give him a little bit of a gameplay update. And it's just going to be better overall for everyone, I think. And then, just to kind of close it out, I want to propose a radical idea. So I've been thinking about this for about a year now. I think it'd be really interesting to take that backline Azir kind of idea, but change him to be an AD champion instead of an AP champion. So my idea is maybe make him AD, make his soldiers apply on hits and crits like an ADC would. And what this can do is this can unlock a lot of different builds for him. I mean, you have Infinity Edge, you have Bloodthirster, which would add the safety that would be needed if mobility is stripped, so he's got a little bit of that health padding there. Gwynsu's, Manamune, Black Cleaver, Youmuu's, the Hydra items, so Ravenous Hydra and Titanic Hydra. You could do Triforce, Wit's End, anything, any AD item can basically work on him depending on your situation. That on top of the fact that he could utilize Red Buff and Fervor of Battle Mastery, or Keystone, sorry. He could use Fervor of Battle or Warlords. So that really opens up a whole lot of playstyles. So the reason that I thought of this is because most of the AD items are already balanced around high attack speed auto attackers. So you think of all the AD items that ADCs can traditionally buy, and it fits perfectly with what Azir does. He's a high attack speed auto attacker that just happens to have many different things auto attacking at once. So what this allows Riot to do is they can strip out some of Azir's built-in power with regards to his range and his damage, his soldier range and his soldier damage, and that can be supplemented by items like Ravenous Hydra and other on-hit items. And this really opens up a lot of different playstyles. Azir could build tankier for more survivability in the backline, so thinking like Titanic Hydra would be perfect for that kind of build. He could build a tank buster, so he could do like Black Cleaver and Lord Dominik's to really get through that armor stat. He could build pure damage, so he could do crit attack speed all the time. And he could have a more utility-oriented ADC in the bot lane, or you could even put a traditional mage in the bot lane and have your ADC as Azir in the mid lane. And then it also opens up the possibility of a viable jungle Azir, which may not be good if they remove his mobility, but it's still a possibility. It's basically not possible right now just because of his weaknesses, but changing him to an AD champion really would open up at least that possibility. So this kind of build that I'm proposing only really works if the mobility is stripped from him. Otherwise, it's really easy for him to become overpowered, because he'd be essentially a melee and a ranged ADC at the same time. It hurts his identity as a summoner of sorts, so it kind of takes away that mage identity where he can conjure soldiers out of sand. So it really wouldn't make sense to have an AD champion that can do kind of this magical stuff, summoning stuff from sand and everything. And it also requires a larger rework and might alienate some of the current Azir players. However small that player base may be, it's still a massive change that really would change his playstyle a lot. But if they're looking to do something radical like that, it'd be interesting to see Riot explore that a little bit. So just to conclude, I'm happy that Riot has at least acknowledged the problems with Azir. It's been a long time that we've gotten no love for him. It's been consistent nerfs, stealth nerfs, all of these issues, and it feels bad as a player when your champion that you love to play doesn't get any attention when he sorely needs it. So I'm glad that Riot is looking at it. I'm grateful that they are. I'm confident that any direction Riot takes him is going to feel good and play well, but I figured I'd just lay out my thoughts kind of my preferences, what makes Azir fun to play, and what his problems are, just to add to the conversation, kind of give my thoughts as a person that has a lot of experience with Azir. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see how it turns out, and I hope that they actually start releasing more skins for him when his gameplay update comes out.